Hey, Damien from Bay Ridge DIY here. We got this table we're going to restore in this video. I got this table about 10 years ago from my sister. She wanted it back fairly soon, so I think 10 years is a good time for that. It flips over, goes from a wall table to a center table. It's got a nice little storage unit underneath this side you can put stuff in. We're going to turn it into something pretty cool, so stick around and I'll show you how we do it. As you can see, the top on this table is pretty warped and pretty rough shape. I don't think we're going to be able to salvage it, so we're going to create a new one. We're going to use Baltic birch for our substrate on here, and then we're going to do a really cool veneer over the top of it. We have to keep in mind that there is two sides to one of the tables, so we have to make sure it's nice and rigid, flat, and we have a good substrate underneath the veneer. We had a few pieces of Baltic birch cut-offs that we had laying around, so we're going to use those for the top. These are 5/8 of an inch thick. This is 3/4 of an inch finish thickness, but once we get done putting the veneer on here, it'll be equal to the original and fit the old hardware really well. Let's go over to the table saw and get these cut down. Here I'm going to use the old hardware for the flip top, and I'm going to measure in 3 inches on each side, and that's where my hinge is going to start. I have these two pieces clamped together so I can get an even line across the top of these, and the hinges will line up with the edges. I took my router and an adjustable fence to make the slots for the hinges. A 1/2 inch bit worked really good because it left a rounded end on the slot, which made the hinges fit in perfect. I went down to a 1/4 inch depth so the top of the hinge would be flush, and then came back and did a 3/4 inch plunge into the middle to allow for the depth of the hinge. After the slots were cut, I reinstalled the old hardware. I then pre-drilled the holes and put the new brass screws in. With the 5/8 Baltic, it did not leave much room for error, but with the veneer technique I will be using, it will have plenty of strength in the end. To cut my veneer, I'm using a CMT laminate and veneer cutter. It's a great way to make quick multiple cuts of the same width. I chose a burl walnut and a quartered eucalyptus for the inside tabletop. We're going to be doing a checkerboard on the inside, so I think the light and dark will make a really good offset. My veneers, I cut them about a 1/4 inch oversize. This allows me to trim them up with a jig and a block plane. The veneer cutter is a nice tool, but it does not give you a finished edge. These are some simple jigs that I made for trimming the veneer. I made them out of some scrap plywood that we had laying around the shop. The first jig is 2 5/8 inch deep, so I can straighten one edge. The second jig is 2 1/2 inches deep to make my final width. A sharp block plane is a must for this technique. If you don't have a sharp block plane, it will chatter along the edge of the veneer and won't let the edges meet up properly. Once the edges are straight, it's time to tape the veneer into place. I like to use a lightweight painter's tape. It doesn't leave any residue on the veneers and makes it easier for finishing. To do this, pinch the edges of the veneer together and tape them in place, working your way down the veneer. I am alternating the veneer strips for my checkerboard pattern. A good thing to note is not to leave the tape on any longer than you have to. Even with good painter's tape, if it's left on too long, it will leave some adhesive. I like to glue my veneer up to a piece of 1/8 inch MDF that I cut out on the table saw to rough size. I then spray the back of the veneer and the face of the MDF with contact adhesive. I press it down with my hands and then go over it with a small wooden roller to get out any air bubbles. After rolling out any remaining air bubbles, it's important to get some pressure down on the veneer. It was a pressure-sensitive adhesive that we put down on the veneer, so it's important to get some weight on top of it. I used a handful of clamps and my battery-operated press. After the adhesive has dried for about 24 hours, I run this through the table saw, cutting it into 2 5/8 inch strips. I'll then trim the ends down with my block plane and alternate every other piece, making it into a checkerboard. Using the same technique as before, I alternated every other piece and taped them together. Then double-sided taped them to a sacrificial board and cut it in half. Once the pieces are cut in half, I can glue it down to the table. I sprayed both the top and the back of the MDF with contact adhesive, letting it get tacky. Taking a straight edge and clamping it to the board is a good way to keep it in line with the lines I have drawn on the board. It does take a little extra pressure because you're going through the MDF. I'll do the same for the other side, lining the squares up onto the board and with each other, leaving a gap in the middle so it can still open and close. After letting the adhesive dry on the checkerboard portion of the table, I took a 1-inch strip of mahogany veneer, glued to an 1/8 inch MDF to match up to the height of the checkerboard. I started with a 45 mitered corner and cut off the straight edge, matching it and working my way around. For the final border on the tabletop, I took a 4-inch strip of the eucalyptus veneer and glued it down to an 1/8 inch piece of hardboard. This will make a nice cap to the end of the tabletop. I pressed these down and put them face to face. Then put a couple boards on top and utilized my battery operated press again to hold them down. After the adhesive was dry, I took them over to the table saw and cut them down to rough size. With this being the last piece of veneer that goes on the table, I don't have to worry about the end being flush, as long as it matches up with the veneer good. I can trim it off later with a flush trim bit. I used some painter's tape and a scrap piece of plywood to reduce overspray on the checkerboard. After spraying the back of the veneer and the table, I place this side in place. Make sure to leave a gap in between the middle of the table so it can open and close. For the last 2 pieces of veneer, it's very important to get the ends very straight. It has to line up with the edge of the other veneer. I marked it with a pencil and went back to the table saw several times to get an exact fit. I then sprayed glue on both sides and pressed it into place. My original plan was to leave the edge raw Baltic birch and do a taper or a round over so you could see the grain. After looking at it, it just didn't match the top of the table real well, so I found a scrap piece of walnut to plane down, cut it into 3/4 inch strips, and we'll glue that up to the sides. After cutting down the walnut boards, I planed them down to the thickness of the tabletop. I marked the edges. I thought a 45 would look good here until I tried it. It didn't match up with the squares on the checkerboard very well. I applied glue and clamps and let these sit overnight. It held up pretty good. Normally I would biscuit this, but since it's not going to be an everyday use table, I didn't think the extra strength was required. I glued my 2 side pieces on first, making sure they're flush to the front and even with the center. I wipe off any excess glue squeeze out with a wet rag. This is going to make a really nice look on the edge of this table. For the closed tabletop, I'll show you another veneer cutting technique that I like to use. Because these veneers are going to be stationary and I can tape them right away, it's easier just to overlap the veneers and then use a straight edge to cut both the veneers at the same time. This will give you a true edge that'll match up really well with each other. I take several passes over the top of the veneers, making sure not to tear out any of the edges. It's really important to cut this multiple times instead of trying to press through it with one cut. After removing the scrap pieces from the cut, I use the same technique in taping, pressing the veneers tight together with my fingers, and then using painter's tape to go over the top of it to keep it in place. Once the veneers are matched and taped together, I spray both sides with contact adhesive. I then line up the center of the table with the center of the veneers. I'm not too worried about overhang here because I'll trim it off with a router later. I press from the center out, making sure it sticks down good, then use my wooden roller to finish it off and get any air bubbles out. After letting the veneer dry up for about 24 hours, I take my router bit with a 45-degree angle on it and make a nice profile along the edge. When working with veneers, I like to do as much hand sanding as possible. They don't always give you the most veneer to work with, and it'd be really bad if you burnt through some of the veneer. Using a low nap mohair roller, I used Sherwin-Williams satin pre-cat lacquer and rolled it on the tabletop. Most of the time I would spray this product, but this being such a small project, it worked out well to roll it. Just make sure if you do roll on pre-cat lacquer that you go from end to end, not stopping in the middle or crossing the grain at all. It'll even itself out really nice. After applying the finish to the tabletop, we ran out to Braxby Woodworks and had Devin cut out some circles for us on his CNC to use as checkers. We'll veneer these with the same types of veneer we used on the tabletop: burl walnut and quartered eucalyptus. CNC made short work of cutting out 24 circles. You could also use a hole saw to do this. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I like the edge of Baltic birch, so I wanted to use those as my checkers. I took some scrap veneer, cut it into squares, and glued it up to the top of the Baltic birch. I'll then bring it over to the router table. After the contact adhesive was dry, I took them over with a flush trim bit on the router table to clean them up. I then used a small round over bit just to clean the sharp edges off of them and give them a nice profile. So we put the finishing touches on our table today. We painted the base black just to keep it simple. I didn't want to have to go down and turn another base just to match the wood on here. I think it turned out pretty good. Flips open nice and easy using the old hardware. All of our lines came in pretty tight. It's a project that most anybody could do, really. There's nothing really complicated about it. Some spray adhesive, utility knife. You can veneer just about anything and make it look new again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, Bay Ridge DIY. Have a good one.